Okay, excellent. Thank you for that introduction. And I like the fact that your class is multidisciplinary. I teach assistive technologies here at ASU out of the computer science department, but the class is open to all disciplines. So I've had students from special education, from psychology, from every type of engineering, from law and justice studies, a wide range of disciplines take the class. And so I pair these different disciplines together, and these student teams pursue projects. And it's really interesting to have these different perspectives come together. So I really appreciate that. So a little bit more background about myself before we dive in. I kind of started in machine learning and computer vision, and then kind of transitioned from or to haptics over a decade ago. And so I would say haptics and human-computer interaction are my main areas of focus. Within those areas, I study our sense of touch from every perspective: neurological, psychological, physiological, toward designing haptic, touch-based devices that can engage our sense of touch in new ways. And of course, there's a lot of assistive technology applications when we think about haptic devices and how they can help people. So I got into assistive technology when I first met Cubic's director, Sathuraman Panchanathan. He goes by Panch for short. So I first met Panch when I was a student here at ASU during my undergrad. And I then, started working in his lab. And I was very inspired by working on assistive technologies because, I really enjoy computer science and programming and building things. But when I saw the impact technologies could make when they're given to someone who has a disability and could really impact their lives, that really inspired me. And so from there, I did a PhD under Ponch, and then upon graduating, he offered me a job. So I'm still here at Cubic working very closely with him as his associate director. In addition to that, I'm the research director of an NSF IGERT project called APAC. I'll talk a little bit about that during the lecture. So in terms of deciding on a topic for today, I decided to talk about haptics and how that kind of relates to the field of gerund technology and some of the projects I'm working on. I'm going to highlight assistive technology projects, rehabilitative projects, and smart environment projects as well. So this is kind of a snapshot of Cubic. So we're a multimedia computing research center. We do human-centered computing, where the human is at the center of all our activities. So we never just jump into a project. We always talk to our target populations first. So with individuals who are blind, we may interview folks or conduct a focus group, or maybe put out a survey to really try to identify the real needs out there that we can try to address. So we never make assumptions about what we can do for different target populations, because we're not experts, right? So if we want to develop a technology for someone who is blind, if you're not blind yourself, you're not an expert in that area, right? You don't live that day in and day out. So we really need to rely upon these people to understand the problem from their perspective. And oftentimes we do participatory research where we actually bring in people to be co-researchers or co-designers. So I've worked with individuals who are blind on projects. I've worked with people who have physical impairments on projects at really all stages of the project. Our core areas are in machine learning, computer vision, and haptics. Here's kind of a snapshot of our application areas, from assistive to rehabilitative to healthcare technologies. So in terms of my core research areas, I'm interested in four main areas in haptics. So from the uh, uh, design of tactile displays, mostly vibrotactile. So most of the time using just simple pancake motors that you'd find in your cell phone, or other types of motors like LRA motors um, that you'd also find in a lot of cell phones. So very simple motors that are low cost, and exploring how we can build different vibrotactile displays and what we can do with them. And then haptic languages. So how can we communicate to users using this alternative modality of touch, and what goes into designing these communications. And so I study how people communicate, and how language and language development, and those different perspectives. And affect. So how can we use haptics to evoke or elicit emotions, is an area of interest of mine. And then lastly, sensory substitution and augmentation. So sensory substitution is a field of research that explores how we can replace one modality with another modality. So if someone has lost their sight, can we instead convey visual information through the sense of touch? And if so, what goes into, how do we map visual to touch? So that's sensory substitution. And then sensory augmentation is expanding the senses beyond what's currently capable. So how can we develop new senses? So that's the field of sensory augmentation. As we go through the lecture today, I'll highlight some examples of that, of both of them. So years ago, I came upon the following work that presented some interesting statistics, and this kind of motivated me to get into gerund technology. And so a lot of what I'll talk about today is kind of based on these initial statistics I stumbled upon. And of course, this was a long time ago, so by now these numbers have probably changed somewhat. But here's some statistics in terms of functional impairments of people 55 or older who live independently. And from here, we kind of identified some projects that could be possible. So for example, for those who have a visual impairment or hearing impairment, how can we develop social assistive aids that can help these individuals in social interactions? That we really got our start in this space working with individuals who are blind or visually impaired, which could also include people who have low vision. And so today I'll talk about some of my work related to social assistive aids. And then in terms of some of these other tasks, how can we address these functional limitations directly? So if someone has challenges in terms of fine motor control and manipulation and dexterity, how can we employ neuro rehab methods or develop new methods to help with functional gains faster than currently what we can achieve? And then some of these other aspects like locomotion or remembering, how can we address some of these challenges directly through different projects targeting health, wellness, and participation in general? So before we kind of dive into the projects, just a little bit more background. So APAC, which stands for Alliance for Person-Centered Accessible Technologies, it's an NSF IGERT program. IGERT stands for Integrative Graduate Education and Research Traineeship. And basically, it's a fellowship program for PhD students. And so this project is about 7 years old now, and it's currently wrapping up. And NSF has replaced the IGERT with the NRT, which is very similar. And we just submitted another NRT proposal. So hopefully that will be kind of the next phase of this. But anyway, this IGERT project, APAC, 7 years in the making, and it's been really interesting because we've been able to take this idea of human-centered computing and take it to the next level. And what we found working with people who have disabilities, you need to go one step further beyond human-centered computing. And really what you need is person-centered computing. And so for years, we've been proposing this idea of person-centeredness, where you work very closely with a single individual and design a technology that's ideal for them. But then the challenge comes in terms of how do we then take that technology and give it to other people and it be just as useful? So in person-centeredness, a lot of the effort is toward co-adaptation, where not only does the user have to adapt to technology, but technology should adapt to the user. So we spend a lot of time kind of developing algorithms that work behind the scenes to adapt. And in the process, we study a lot of different dimensions, from the socio-technical aspects to socio-personal dynamics, human-centered design, all these different components. And it's very interdisciplinary. So we have a variety of disciplines, as you can see on the screen there, involved in this IGERT project. Just to highlight some of the disciplines, everything from biomedical engineering and kinesiology to policy and society to, hardcore computer science, topics like machine learning and computer vision. So a variety of disciplines represent it. So I want to talk now about social assistive aids. So just to give a little background on social interactions, it turns out that when we socially interact with someone, in terms of the information exchange, the majority of it is nonverbal. So for example, this could be facial expressions. It could be gestures, so maybe hand gestures, eye gaze, so where we look, our physical appearance, who we are, proxemics or interpersonal distance, so how far we are away from someone, and personal mannerisms. So these are some examples of different nonverbal cues. And so that on average makes up about 65% of the information exchanged. Now, not every time is this information relevant to the conversation, but it still plays an important part in the interaction. So to start, we had a focus group of individuals who are blind to kind of tease out real problems we could address. And one thing that came up time and time again is people who are blind really struggle in social interactions, especially in the work environment. And so we had people tell us they're in a meeting, they think a question is addressed to them, but it turns out it was addressed to someone else. And that's because eye gaze is often used to address a question towards someone. And this would create an embarrassing situation for them. Or they'd pass someone in the hallway and they'd wonder, well, was that my coworker or not? Or are they just being quiet because they don't want to talk to me? So we wanted to address this problem for people who are blind. And so we kind of narrowed it down to 3 steps. The first is sensing. How do we extract information from the environment? And kind of coupled to that is processing. So once we extract, say, video from the environment, how do we begin to recognize these nonverbal cues? So a lot of our effort in the beginning went toward a lot of machine learning and computer vision work. And we are still working on some of these problems today, particularly facial expression recognition and emotion recognition. We started out in working on face and person detection, and face detection nowadays is a solved problem. So when you take a photo and you post it on Facebook, you get the rectangles around the faces. Face detection is quite robust. But we started in that, and then went to person recognition and head pose estimation, but nowadays mostly focused on facial expression recognition. And we've done a little work in body gesture recognition, but mostly with facial expressions. So it's interesting, but probably the biggest challenge we ran into is once we extract this information from video, um, uh, how do we deliver it to the user? Because what we found out very quickly is that if you extract this information, okay, so the person in front of you is smiling, okay, they're nodding their head, okay, they're looking over here. If you convey that through audio, you obstruct hearing. And so someone who is blind will tell you that's like blindfolding someone who is sighted. I use my hearing to receive all this information from the environment. So we realized early on we had to explore a different modality, and so we decided to look at the sense of touch. And that's really, around this time, I think it was about 2008 that I got really interested in the sense of touch and haptic technologies. One of the first nonverbal cue we explored was, very simply, where is someone standing relative to you? So the direction of that person. Are they right in front of you? Or are they off to your right side, off to your left side? And it may seem trivial that you can extract this information by just listening to someone, but during interactions, they can be quite dynamic, and that person's not always talking. So people who are blind will tell you, sometimes I'm talking to someone and they move a little bit, they shift, and I'm still looking in that same direction, yet now they're over here, and it's embarrassing for me. Or I've had many people who are blind tell me that I'm talking with someone at a conference and they get bored of the conversation and just walk off. And so this kind of information is really important to people who are blind. And so we started building haptic belts. These are just belts with vibration motors around the waist, and linked this up to a very simple face detection algorithm. And based upon your visual field, so we have a video camera discreetly embedded in a pair of sunglasses, and from that video, we do face detection, and based upon where that face is, you feel the vibration. So if I'm looking and the face is on this side, I may feel the vibration on this side of my waist versus the other side. If I'm looking right at them, I'll feel them at my midline. And so we did a very simple pilot test, and for people who are blind, they told us, like, wow, this is like an instant reflex. I don't need any training. I know exactly where you guys are at in front of me. And they were interacting with 2 or 3 people. And so they could turn to each and make eye contact. And so we realized, wow, there's a lot of potential here in terms of designing haptic belts to aid in situational awareness. And of course, we did a lot of work in looking at the psychophysics of this as well, how well people can recognize vibrations around their waist, how many motors could we fit in there, and so forth. We also looked at interpersonal distance, so how far someone is away from you. And we started out looking at just the cue of duration, okay, how long that vibration is. So for example, you could link up a short duration to someone very close to you versus a long duration, indicating someone's far away from you, or you could flip that mapping. So just that simple cue of duration. Or you could design vibrotactile rhythms. So different beats, maybe a fast beat indicates someone's close versus beats that have a greater space between them could indicate someone's far away. So we started to do all these studies, and we kind of mapped these to interpersonal distances that are common in American culture. So it turns out these vary across cultures. In American culture, we have what we call intimate distance, personal distance, social distance, and public distance. And so, public distance would be like if you're giving a lecture, your distance away from the audience, versus social distance is you and a group of friends are chatting, versus personal, that may be like a one-on-one conversation, and so forth. So we started mapping these different patterns to these distances. And our results were pretty good, decent recognition accuracy, but perhaps not as intuitive as they could be. And so we began to explore the analogy of a heartbeat, and with the idea being as that person's getting closer and closer to you, the heartbeat that you feel through this vibrotactile rhythm, the tempo is increasing, indicating that the interaction is becoming more and more intimate as that person leaves public, goes to social, goes to personal, and so forth. And so that really resonated with participants. It was easy to understand, intuitive, and so we had quite a bit of success with this. And then in fact, with public distance, we just use like a sonar pulse because it's not personal at all. It's much farther out there, so it doesn't have a heartbeat represented with it. And so we also invested a lot of time in the design of haptic belts and putting out there different design guidelines for other researchers and different aspects to look at in terms of functionality, performance, and usability. We also have spent a lot of time looking at how to convey facial expressions. And so on the left there, you can see different representations we've come up with. So for example, we use the shape of the mouth. So happy, you feel a pattern that feels like a U shape. And these patterns vary in space and time, so they move across your hand. Sad, you feel, basically, we invert it. Surprise, a circle. So we try to mimic the shape of the mouth. We had a lot of success with this particular user study. In fact, people who are blind told us, now that you've given me a sense of what's possible, keep in mind, some of these people they've never seen facial expression. Some of them are born blind. And so this kind of opened up a new window for them. And a lot of these people said, so now that I have access to just a few facial expressions here, I want to feel more information. Can I actually feel someone's face without literally feeling their face? And so they can access all those subtleties of expressions. And we said, well, that's challenging, but we'll give it a try. And so we built what we call the haptic face display, which is a two-dimensional vibrotactile display that we've embedded on the back of a chair. And so you basically have a webcam set up on a tabletop as you're interacting with someone. And so we can extract facial expressions in real time and deliver them to the back of the chair. And we started with kind of a literal or really a semi-literal mapping where we extract the building blocks of facial expressions called facial action units. So it turns out, like when we make a happy face, that's actually very complex in terms of the muscle movements happening in the face. And it turns out you can take any expression or emotion and break it down into these low-level building blocks. So for example, we have everything from lowering of the brows to how the lip corners are changing to nose wrinkler, all these low-level building blocks. And we designed vibrotactile patterns to represent these, and we got pretty good recognition accuracy across these, and participants overall found them intuitive. But we also wanted to look at symbolic representations. So going back to my interest in affect, could we design patterns that actually evoke these emotions in users? And what we actually found from that first study with the glove that you guys saw is that people, the pattern for fear actually made people fearful. And so that pattern for fear is a quick vibration back and forth across the fingertips. And it gave participants like this tingling sensation in their fingers, and it actually evoked fear in many participants. And that was an interesting result. And we decided to explore this further using the haptic face display. And so we started with a huge design space of patterns. People came in, they felt these patterns, and kind of indicated if it evoked any emotion or none at all. And we actually did find some consensus. So, for example, 30% of participants, roughly, said that this pattern we called snake made them happy. And what it feels like is actually, when we designed it, we thought, okay, this kind of feels like a snake slithering across your back because it goes back and forth. And this is going to make people fearful, but it actually made people happy because it reminded them of their childhood back when, being siblings, their sibling would draw letters on their back, and you'd try to guess the letter. And so that made people happy. So this was an interesting insight into, potentially designing patterns that could evoke strong emotions in people to make communication even faster. I describe it as kind of using haptics to get on the same page, if you will, of someone else to understand their emotions. So kind of shifting gears now and looking at our work in rehab, this was another space of big interest of mine, and it actually started out in motor learning, traditional motor learning. So I was very interested in how people learn motor skills. So oftentimes we do this in a group setting. We try to mimic the instructor. But it's really tough, right? The instructor has limited time, has to divide his or her attention across the people in the session. For those who have taken, these group exercise classes or martial arts, you know what I'm talking about. Everyone learns a little differently. Some are visual learners. Some need that hands-on training. There's also a lot of distractions. And then one-on-one instruction also has its problems. In some sports, the instructor can't always be with you. So snowboarding is a great example of that. And in some sports, your senses are overloaded. So like with music, the instructor has to stop you and give you feedback, and then you can continue playing. So I was interested in exploring how we could augment motor learning using haptics. Around the same time, a lot of the ideas I was exploring, people were saying you need to look at neuro rehab, specifically look at stroke rehabilitation, because a lot of what you're exploring applies there. And so I started looking at that as well. And during the summer of, summer of 2012, we interviewed over 100 physical therapists, occupational therapists, stroke neurologists, and stroke survivors. And we really wanted to identify what the main problems were in stroke rehab. And we found that the exercises these people are asked to do at home outside of their clinic visits are very boring. So I have some of the exercises shown on the screen here. No one wants to do these exercises all day. They're boring. Also, most of the time, the patient doesn't know whether or not they're doing them correctly. And then when they have to report back to their therapist, the report's not very accurate because they forget everything. So the accuracy is not where it needs to be. And so we decided to see if we could try to tackle both of these domains. And a major basis for the design of this is saltation. So saltation is a perceptual illusion in our sense of touch, where we can feel vibrations where they're not actually happening. So, for example, some of the wearables that we've built, this was one of the first prototypes. As you can see, there's a lot of wires everywhere, but we did this as a proof of concept. And so with the saltation effect, if I have a motor placed at the wrist, one at the elbow, and then one at the shoulder, with saltation, if I get the timing of the vibrations just right, so if I send you pulses, quick pulses along your skin, if I get the timing of this just right, you actually won't feel localized pulses at each of these sites. What you'll feel is something like this. You feel taps in between along your skin, and that's known as saltation, and then it's a perceptual illusion. And it actually can occur in other modalities like vision as well. And so we've used that to take the limited set of motors we can put on the body and really create rich vibrotactile patterns. And we've created, we started by creating an instruction set using saltation, where we could provide instructions to basically provide a cue to people who are training at home to perform a movement. And and these instructions are specifically for the fundamental movements of the human body. So flexion and extension, abduction, adduction, and rotation. So if I have patterns that tell you, okay, now rotate your arm, or now flex your arm, or extend your arm, the idea would be to build up these instructions to communicate to you more complex patterns. So you feel these instructions, and then you know which movement to perform next. And it turns out that you can actually come up with different metaphors to teach people these. And we came up with two, one called follow me and one called push pull. And it turns out for different fundamental movements, some of these conceptual mappings work better than others. But of course, this is missing one important piece of information, and that's feedback. So we can tell people the movement they need to do, but then we need to tell them how well they did the movement. And so we've done a lot of work into looking at low cost but accurate motion capture. And so we're using inertial sensing for that. Basically on the right, just this inertial, it's an IMU, inertial sensor. Just think of it as detecting orientation, okay? And so if we put that on the body, if I have, for example, one here and one here, now I can get the angle at the elbow, okay? If I have one on the back of the hand and one on the forearm, now I can get the angle of the wrist. We can do that in real time. So we can actually do full body motion capture if you have these across the body in a low cost way and still have pretty good accuracy. In terms of providing feedback to the user, again, we use these different metaphors to teach people. So if I feel a vibration, here, for example, it may mean, okay, I need to move this way. It's pulling my arm. Versus if I feel a vibration here, it may mean move this way, so it's pushing. So you can come up with different mappings to push and pull the limbs, or this follow me mapping across the joints as well. And so we explored these for feedback too, for angle adjustments, so pose adjustments. But we also looked at speed. So how can we provide feedback to users on speed adjustments? Because sometimes users may be moving too slow, or they may actually be moving too fast and risking re-injury. And so we came up with different tactile rhythms that intuitively can communicate speed, and it's a relative recognition. So you feel this bass rhythm, and then it slows down or speeds up in real time, indicating adjustments you need to make. So we did a lot of this work on wearables, and then we realized, well, let's take a step back, and can we do something even simpler? Can we just provide, send someone a reminder cue, a vibration that tells them, hey, you're not doing enough exercise today. You need to do more to meet performance goals that the therapist has defined for you. And so we came up with this idea of a reminder system for adaptive performance goals. So you wear these wristbands, and throughout the day, it's monitoring physical activity and provides you with reminders to increase physical activity, whatever that may be. It could be just movements involved in activities of daily living. We just wanted people to be more physically active. This was an interesting project, but now with smartwatches being ubiquitous, the same functionality could be implemented in a smartwatch. So we created these wristbands just before smartwatches hit the market, and so you could have the same functionality in a smartwatch. So much smaller form factor than what we created here. So we're doing all this work, and we realized that originally the tasks were kind of boring, and now we're asking people to do these other types of exercises, which unfortunately may also be quite boring. So we decided to kind of pivot and look at serious games. So basically get people involved in games that don't feel like exercises. And we started out looking at trainer-patient interactions and the movements involved, and how we could map those different movements to a game environment. And we actually decided to kind of use a combination of low-cost technologies. So we use the Connect, and we created the device shown on the right that has, we basically modified a Wiimote. So we have very simple motion capture using the Wiimote's capabilities, an inertial sensor basically, and then we augmented the vibration capabilities of the Wiimote to create this cylindrical device we call the intelligence stick. And basically, you hold it with both hands. So bimanual manipulation, that's important, get both sides of the brain working. And it's basically your game controller. So on the bottom left here are two games we created. One is a driving game, so you can use the device to steer a vehicle. And then on the right, we created our version of Fruit Ninja. And so you're basically, slicing fruit that's thrown in the air. But what's novel, there's two novelties with our work here. One is mapping exercises to the game controls. So to perform the games or to play the games, you do your exercises, but we do it in a way that it is natural. And the other interesting aspect here is something called stealth assessment and adaptation. This isn't new, but we've applied it in a unique way to our own work. So with stealth assessment and adaptation, we're assessing performance behind the scenes and then adapting, in this case, the game based on the assessment. So for example, you're playing the driving game and you're not doing too well, you're running off the road. Well, we want to maintain that state of flow, state of challenge. We don't want people to get discouraged. So in real time, we widen the track and the curved roads become less curved, making it easier. And then once you get better, we narrow the track, sharper turns. Okay, in the Fruit Ninja game, if you're struggling, the fruits become bigger, so watermelon, and they're slower, okay? As you get better, the fruits become smaller, so maybe kiwis, maybe strawberries, and they fly through the air a little bit faster. So we can dynamically adapt the game based on your performance, which is assessed behind the scenes using self-assessment techniques. Okay, so lastly, I want to talk about some of our work in health, wellness, and participation. So I'm very much interested in exercise compliance, and I think it's a very important topic because if someone is doing their exercises incorrectly, can actually result in pretty serious injuries. So we started working with someone who has cerebral palsy, and she has limited proprioception, and so doesn't always know where her limbs are at in space. And so working with her therapist, she does a lot of exercises on the total gym, which is shown in the upper left. So it's like this this sliding bench that you can hook up some weights to. But she's always falling off of it and getting hurt. And so we asked the question, well, can we provide some additional feedback that provides cues into compliance? So, for example, we put a Wii Fit at the bottom of the base, because a lot of the exercises she does are basically bending her legs and then jumping off the board, jumping off the platform to slide the board up higher. And so based on that, she can now, and we created a visualization of the pressure, center of pressure shown on the bottom left. So now when she's on the board, she can understand kind of the pressure she's applying, and then as she jumps off and lands, kind of see where her center of pressure is. And so this has been very helpful. And the other issue is where her body's at on the board. And we're using vibrotactile feedback for that. So as her body kind of shifts more and more, she gets a vibration kind of telling her to move back the other way. So we're exploring different ways that we can augment the feedback to support exercise compliance. And then another project in this space that we've been working on is in the realm of Parkinson's disease. So a big issue in Parkinson's disease is freezing of gait. So as someone's walking, their walking may freeze up. So they start to shuffle, their feet start to shuffle, and then it gets to a point where they actually can freeze up and can't move anymore, and that may result in a fall. And oftentimes, this is brought on by kind of being overloaded with things. So it's called dual task. So for example, if someone's with Parkinson's disease has to cross a street, so they get the crosswalk signal. Now there's multiple things they have to pay attention to. Okay, are any other cars coming when they're not supposed to? Am I going to make it across the street in time? So it's very stressful. They have to pay attention to multiple things, and that can bring on a freezing of gait episode. And so a lot of the work in this space is aimed at recognizing these episodes, but that's the easy problem. We know when the walking has stopped. That's easy to recognize. The hard problem is predicting an upcoming freezing of gait episode. And this is a problem we've been exploring using basically neural network models and machine learning. So we recently published a recurrent neural network model to try to predict freezing of gait and gotten promising accuracy. So this is still a very active area of research for us, looking at predicting freezing of gait. And again, inertial sensing. So we use accelerometers. The device on the top right, which is a sock, is embedded with an accelerometer as well as a pressure sensor. The last project I want to talk about before we can then open it up to questions is our Smart Stadium project. So to give a little background on this, about 3 years ago, we started working with Intel to turn ASU Sun Devil Stadium into a smart stadium. And so working with Intel, we built 44 sensor boxes that were deployed across the south lower bowl of the stadium. And in each box, we have a variety of sensors, everything from microphones to vibration sensors, Bluetooth low energy, temperature sensors, and other sensors as well. And the reason for that was to kind of augment the stadium, turn it into a smart stadium, have that infrastructure in place where we could begin exploring different applications. We started with looking at how we can enrich the fan experience. So for example, everything from using CCTV footage, video cameras, security cameras within the stadium to do some visual analytics and try to recognize abnormal crowd behavior. So for example, we can train a model on typical crowd behavior, but then abnormal crowd behavior happens when maybe people, maybe a fight's broken out and people are gathering, or maybe someone has spilled a drink and people are moving around it. Can we recognize these abnormal crowd behaviors and alert security right away? So that would be geared toward safety. Another is our wait time project, where from your mobile device, can we access in real time different wait times at concession stands or restrooms across the stadium. So again, just adding to the convenience for the fan. And that's using vision-based approaches as well. We're using a density estimation technique, all from video. Another project in this space is serious games for fans. So we're exploring the possibility of having different stations set up in the stadium where someone can walk up to it and learn a sports movement and see how they're doing compared to their favorite athlete. So we're using very simple, low-cost motion capture, using a combination of Kinect and inertial sensing, and then haptic, visual, and audio feedback. So you can get a score based on how you perform. There's a scoreboard, so it can get competitive and fun for fans. Related to individuals who have disabilities or Geron technology in general, the next stage of this is exploring virtual reality in the context of a smart stadium. And it's funny in the sense that when I mentioned virtual reality to the athletics department, there's some concern there, right? Because they want people to come to the stadium, not stay home and use virtual reality. So the idea would be, can we let someone attend a game remotely through the use of virtual reality? And so you may have, 360-degree vision, so you can look around, and through the microphones you can hear the game, and through the vibration sensors you can feel the rumble of the crowd using haptics technologies embedded into chairs. And yes, we are exploring this idea of attending a game remotely, but also it has big potential for people who have disabilities that actually prevent them or make it difficult to attend a game physically. So how can we kind of leverage that social field for people with disabilities, or for the elderly population, to allow them to participate in sporting events like this? So that's a project that we actually just got funded. And so we're working on now these multimodal virtual reality experiences for sporting events. All right. So, of course, this work would not be possible without all my students. So I have a photo of our students here at Cubic. And throughout the presentation, I put links to the papers for more details. But if you have trouble accessing a paper or want more information on a project, feel free to reach out to me. And then I put a link to our lab's website at the bottom there as well. So thank you. And I guess now we can open it up to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Troy. Can you hear us okay out here?
Yes, I can hear you. Yep, loud and clear.
These are some really cool projects. Before I let students dig into the serious questions, I want to know if the Serious Athletic Games app is generally available.
So that one, not yet. So where we're at on that project, that the Serious Games for Fans, so we were able to begin that project with a seed grant. So we at least got, a functional prototype off the ground, and we demoed it at ACM Multimedia very recently. I think I think it was in 2016, and it went really well for us. We won a Best Demo Award for it, so people really liked it and had a lot of fun with it. And we wanted to. We're currently exploring how we can kind of take it to the next level. Improve the feedback that it gives you, and kind of improve the motion capture aspects as well. And so it's at a stage right now where we are exploring future funding opportunities for the project. So it's not quite ready for deployment, but hopefully very soon. And in fact, I have people from ASU athletics reaching out to me like, hey, are you ready to deploy this in the stadium? Because we want our athletes to try it out, and we can generate a lot of publicity and do some really cool things with it. So, but yeah, hopefully soon. Trying to explore different funding opportunities so we can continue to improve it and get it ready for that stage.
For sure. I might follow up with you because that one sounds interesting. But I know, did you have a question, Jason?
Yeah, I had a question about that haptic belt that you talked about at the beginning of your presentation.
Okay.
You talked about how it vibrates their pulses when they're like closer or farther away from someone. Does that vibration just continue to vibrate, or does it only go for a certain period of time? So I would imagine that would get annoying or obnoxious to the user.
Right, absolutely. So one thing we found with haptic devices, the sense of touch affords designs that can be discrete and personal, which is a great advantage of communicating information through the sense of touch. But also what we found is that there's a certain period of time where it can be annoying. And so and that kind of threshold is different for everyone. So it really necessitates this person-centered approach. So we find with some people, they don't need it all the time. For some people, they do want it all the time. And for some people, they want it, but then want to have total control over when they can turn it off. So absolutely. And in fact, we find that for most users, it's useful to communicate only changes. So when someone enters, say for example, social space, you send the pattern. And then when they enter personal space, you send the pattern. But when they're at that distance, you don't convey any information. So you just convey the changes. So we found that has worked well for a lot of users. But you're absolutely right. You have to be careful because you don't want to frustrate the user. So they do need some control over it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Troy, the work you're doing is amazing. I guess
Thank you.
I like the person-centered approach, and I understand all the difficulties that come with it because it's certainly something that we struggle with. I'm curious, in taking this approach, are you building this flexibility into your models then so that other people will be able to use them and kind of adjust things? Or are you really working like with each person individually?
Right, yeah, good question. So we do work with people individually, but we always have in mind the flexibility that will be required. So for example, we try to understand the flexibility that will be needed. So we may start by working with one individual, but then we may kind of branch out and begin working with other people. We may do even bigger efforts through interviews, focus groups, and surveys to try to get a better understanding of our target population to kind of figure out the flexibility that's needed. And so then we spend a lot of time thinking about these co-adaptive algorithms, thinking about, for example, one aspect that we often use is contextual ideas from contextual computing or contextually aware computing. So context plays a big role. And so for the social interaction assistant, we may be working with a user who spends most of his or her time at work. Or we may work with someone who spends most of his or her time at home. And so context is important because that will kind of tell us what social cues may be most important to that user. So it kind of goes beyond personalization. I mean, we do have a personalization capabilities built in because everyone's different and they want to adjust the settings. But person-centeredness goes beyond personalization because a lot of how we're adapting the technology is happening automatically and behind the scenes. So it's a really challenging problem. But our approach has been, yes, working with individual users, but trying to get a broader sense of our target populations to figure that out. But it turns out that as we're working on a project for people with disabilities, eventually that technology will find its way to the broader population. One great example is our note taker device we built for students who are low vision to take notes in the classroom. And we deployed this and we were testing these devices across ASU, NAU, and U of A here in Arizona with low vision students. And then suddenly people who are sighted, no visual impairment, started to come to us and said, hey, I saw, my classmate using your note taker device, and I know it records the lectures, allow you to annotate all the recordings and take notes, and has all these cool features. I could really use that to take notes and study as well. Can I get one? And so we often, start with an individual, broaden it from there, and then eventually it broadens even further. And so it makes this challenge of co-adaptation and flexibility even that more challenging.
Can I ask one more quick question?
Yeah.
With your Parkinson's patients, the work that you're doing with identifying freezing, are you also doing any work with how then to help prevent that freezing? And if you are, what sort of things are you putting in place?
Oh, great question. Yeah, in fact, completely forgot to talk about the delivery component there. I did want to talk about the the haptic feedback part of this project. So yes, absolutely. So we try to predict the freezing of gait and use haptics as an unobtrusive way to communicate to the user about issues and try to redirect their attention back on their walking patterns so that they can avoid a freezing of gait episode. And one thing that's really interesting here is in working with physical therapists, there was a lot of concern about this because they said, well, you're trying to communicate through vibrations, you may inadvertently cause a freezing of gait episode because now this is one more thing that they have to pay attention to. And so we're well aware of that challenge. And so the key will be designing these patterns in a way that are intuitive, and we believe with enough training that they won't be problematic. And so we're spending a lot of time getting the designs right. And so to start, it kind of makes sense to deliver the vibration to the spot of the issue. So maybe to the leg, to the ankle, around that area. But to start, we're using a haptic belt actually. And we've just finished our design of very intuitive cues that kind of mimic a therapist's instructions. So move forward, take a step forward, things of that nature. Move right foot forward, left foot forward. So there's different haptic patterns you can use to try to communicate that pattern and that information in a very natural way. And in fact, a lot of these cues can elicit these movements. So you feel the pattern and naturally you want to make those movements. So we finished the designs of those. And this summer, we're going to be conducting a user study with Parkinson's disease patients to try out the technology and see how it works. So we're really looking forward to seeing the results we get from that.
Exciting. Yeah, I look forward to that. That reminds me of the video we saw a while back with a gentleman who would use a metronome who had Parkinson's, and external stimuli kind of helped them think about their gait. Well, we have to close because some students have other classes, but thank you for your time. That was great so much.
Great, yeah. Yeah, you're welcome. And I really enjoyed giving the talk. And Diane, thank you so much for inviting me. And it was nice meeting all of you.